What is musical form? The study of music is the study of the forms of sound, sonic shapings and patterns, sonic processes and events, sonic environments, emotions, ideas, even sonic metaphors and witticisms. Now, anything that creates order or coherence can be considered as part of the form. More than intervals or scales, before it's analyzed into concepts, music has an organic form that we can appreciate without having to think about it. And rather than something static like the figures of geometry and architecture, musical form is dynamic, growing and decaying in time. Much of musical form is in the form of style and character, something rooted in the lived body and the voice and our embodiment and action in the world as humans. Rhythm is first felt in the heartbeat and in our breath. Tempo is rooted in a certain relation of our interpretation of the speed of a leisurely stroll or a somber march or a sprint. Musical form is first and foremost this diffuse, only quasi-conscious sense, this feeling that sets in like a mood. We don't notice it at first, but gradually it makes itself known in our reactions to things. It's a meaning that we can't explain, but that we easily recognize and is immediately obvious to us. It's a clear experience in some sense, but it's too complex, too subtle to describe. Vladimir Jankelevich rightly sees the origin of musical form in this kind of diffuse, quasi-conscious meaning, a je ne sais quoi, an I know not what, this unnameable quality that is almost nothing, presque rien. It is simultaneously almost nothing, intangible, and yet is everything in music. The form is particular, and while we obviously contrast the form of one piece of music to other pieces of music that we have experienced before, the cognition of music comes about through some of this kind of comparing. Well, while that's the case, similitude is not the primary way that music appears to us, but it rather is difference which predominates in these immediate sensations. What we perceive, what we sense, are fundamental contrasts. Louder, softer, sharper, flatter, faster, slower. The musical experience, at its most fundamental level, its raw, unanalyzed level of immediacy, as feeling, consciousness, memory, enactment, that is to say, in our active, engaged participation in music, it is something that has a multitude of potential contrastable parts, and we're not necessarily cognitively making all of those contrasts. Every part of music is a form, involving movement, and therefore duration and change. It is not reducible to the present moment of sensation, nor to something already made. Musical forms are not always perceived as movement, and yet the rest and stability that we perceive is purely perspectival. The string vibrates constantly, and we hear a single unmoving tone. The rhythm repeats with a similar distribution of up and down beats. Regular motion, therefore, is perceived as rest and order. The melody uses the same basic scalar structure. Musical form is not rest, though, and order is not the only way to have musical form, and order is not reducible to scalar structure. It is the dynamic and durational continuity, a coexistence of a multitude of movements and patterns that makes up musical forms. A single tone is sensed as movement. It is felt for example, when we hit a piano string as a clashing pluck, and it grows and vibrates louder, undulating as the overtones interact and contrast with each other. But gradually, the note fades into silence. It has a durational profile changing at every moment, and every moment is felt in its particular place in that durational unfolding. Makes sense in a certain irreversible series: clang, overtonal wash, gradual decay. The moments flow into each other and have a meaning in their order. This natural entropy of tonal sounds, related to their sympathetic resonance on the one hand and dissonant interference on the other hand, we could say their integration and dissipation. This is essential to the most rudimentary aspects of musical sound, the tones themselves. But musical form is of a higher order of magnitude. Its form is a higher order of magnitude than the form of tones. Now, structure in music is primarily a byproduct of repetition, but it manifests in qualities that endure and can be developed. Even orchestration follows some basic trends in instrument voicing. The orchestration of a piece, you'll find often that it's clearest, the tone will be the most clear, the melody will stay clearest if we use, for instance, octaves on the woodwinds, or have our instruments span 4 octaves. Rather than spanning 1 octave, it will be very muddy, all the instruments playing over top of each other. The general trends are baked, you could say, baked into the properties of sound. These aren't made up human things. The general trend is there not just because we're used to it, but because the musician finds that this is the clearest way to orchestrate. General trends exists in part because of the nature of sound itself, especially the harmonic series, and the fact that we find it so resonant, strong, and stable. And again, this is because of the properties of the sound itself. It's pleasurable in and of itself, and yet music is more than this pleasure, in the same way that poetry is a subtler pleasure, a more complex pleasure, for example, than smelling a flower. Music is sonic poetry, we could say, and the pure tones coexist and enhance the subtle pleasure related to its more complex forms. So in the same way that smelling a rose can help, write poetry, it can be an inspiration for poetry, the pleasure of the sounds can contribute to music, while music is not reducible to those pleasures. We could enjoy, for example, a comedian's voice, and this is separate from our appreciation of their wit. And we may love the timbre of a saxophone in addition to the pleasure we feel from its graceful melody that it traces. Musical form is seemingly unlimited in its integrative potential. From the symphony to the synthesizer, humans have pushed and pushed how far we can go in terms of enhancing and expanding the musical content, the content of musical form. Just as a poet is inspired by the scent of a flower, the musician is inspired by the tones, and they weave them in certain ways because of the tones, not because they project their preconceptions or their tradition onto the sounds. Now, if melody is the form of tonal continuity, then the form of the musician themselves as a psychophysical being is a form of love, a love of the sounds, and for the patterns which can come out of the sounds which they have heard growing up, and a love of the comradeship with others engaging in musical activities, and a love for tune and groove. It's a love for the form of music. The form of music must ultimately be sought in this devotion of the heart and in this festive, almost mystical union that we feel, that we experience when we make music together. It is based on these forms that the more heady, witty, and playful experimental forms of music can grow. So we have musical form in its gestural, quasi-conscious complexity, and we have the form of a musical consciousness. And these are inseparable. And it's from these that even more complex forms of music can emerge. Now, some aspects of music are more primary, and others are therefore conditioned. They are later developments that presuppose a series of earlier events having arisen. The lived experience of music is lived, of course, because it is immediately experienced, and which I say instead of subjective to avoid certain connotations, metaphysical commitments, but I intend to include perceptions, feelings, emotions, ideas, things typically called subjective. But it is lived in another sense because of this past tense. And so, musical form is something that isn't merely immediate, not merely mediated either, but I mean mediated by a concept or a memory image. It is also something diffuse, something in the background. It is a context, a depth, and a horizon, something that we cannot immediately contact, and something that is irreducible to mediation. The present appears in relation to the past. We never confront a present without a pastless present, nor do we confront the past as if it were present. We relate to the past as an absence. We can't remember something, for example. We are in proximity to the past in this moment. We are not ignorant of the reality of the past, although we are forgetful. We cannot presently recollect this reality. When we succeed in remembering it, we think that we are holding on to something that existed somewhere before the act of remembering. Where was the past when we couldn't remember it, when we couldn't access it? The same question arises, where is the musician's skill when they're not using it? Where is the totality of our memories, of musical experiences and practice when it is influencing our active engagement in music, when we're playing and composing? Where is the past in that process? Musical skill, as well as participatory musical experience, is a virtue. And virtues have a virtual reality, in addition to having a present actuality. So actual and virtual. When a musician is playing a song, actualizing their musical potential, they do not exhaust their full potential to act. Of course, when musicians and composers give it their all, as we say, we want to say that they use their whole soul, that their whole soul went into the making of the music, that it came from their depths, and that perhaps even it transformed them. This whole need not be the totality of musical potentiality. The musician can play other songs and other genres, and the composer can even develop and evolve their style. So the form of music related to its potential for being actualized is clearly not something reducible to actuality, reducible to the present, and reducible to presence to consciousness. Music exists as much in the past and in virtuality as in the present and in actuality. Form itself is not mere activity, but consists more in a nascent change of direction. This is a phrase coming from Henri Bergson. It is an enrichment of the past experience through a process of invention and artistic expression. It is as much a paradigm shift, a change of direction, a nascent change of direction, which reveals a new world, a new horizon, a new calling, a new vocation. The truth is that the past is not stored in the brain, but rather the brain is continuously developing and adapting its past adaptations to the present. It is a process of developing and transforming, finding patterns that build and resonate. The brain is an adaptation of adaptations, a form that creates forms and yet remains embryonic, remains able to change. It is an evolutionary organ. The brain is also a sponge, soaking up forms, and it can become tinged with putrid odors. Egoism is a persistent threat to the spirit of music, since it has a certain endogenous origin in the brain. It goes beyond and welcomes the acquired forms of character, and especially coming from certain trends within the cultures of Europe. The form that generates the forms of music is a complex sensory motor habitus, a habit which one inherits from their past and which is modulated by our mood. Your moods and habits shape your attitude. One might listen to music that is similar to their mood, or they might listen to something in order to shift their mood. One must tune in, modulate to its peculiar patterning, and gradually attune to its essence, its mood, its style. Musicians devote themselves to practice, and this practice is as much a psycho-spiritual therapy for the self and for community as it is a skill development. Music is perhaps the ultimate display of human diversity of expression. Consider the vast repertoire of a single musical practitioner. They perform a vast array of different styles, genres, and traditions. Even in the case of a single performer, with their multiplicity of influences, they actualize a singular coming together of a sonic world. Music is diverse both in its part and in its whole. When we look at any part, it proves to be a perspective on the whole. It's not a part as severed from the whole. Just as each musician in a band has a perspective on the whole of music, the performance they create together is a whole composed of wholes, and it actualizes a singular, sui generis form that does not exhaust the possibilities of the parts, because the parts are wholes with a virtual reality that exceeds their actualization. We cannot, in principle, attune to every contrastable factor in a musical plenum at once. It is too vast. Take, for example, the overtones of a single key struck on a piano. We can tune in to the individual overtones, and this actually takes considerable effort and skill. Now see if you can hear those overtones in this note. We can now try to do this for the notes of multiple notes in a chord and across shifting chords over time. We modulate our attention in a symphony from one instrument to another. We modulate our attention while listening to a symphony from one instrument to another. And while actively listening, there are 30 instruments playing simultaneously, and while it's all there at once, we need to glance over them like vision scans a landscape. We can also dilate our attention to follow the musical plenum as a single mass that undulates and thrashes. This diffuse awareness is not the same as being aware of every detail in spotlight consciousness. Instead of attentively observing every contrast, we open ourselves to this diffuse, unconscious state where the plenitude of details in both becoming and in our associations and imagination that arises from memory and these virtual images, all of this can happen simultaneously without being filtered. So musical form is not something that we can immediately apprehend and make a list of categories, a finite set of forms, and say, these are the musical forms, this is how we measure them, and these are objective features of music. It is something much more embodied, something that has to do with our sensory motor system, with our habits, with our breath, with our movement, right? But what are the most salient, relevant aspects of musical form? What, as a musical practitioner, must we identify and follow and use in our composition and in our performance? I have created a short list here that I want to go through and break down one after another. We have the motive, we have rhythmical elements and melodic elements. These are subset of motives. We have the feel, which is adjacent to the idea of style. And then we have more complex forms, and these have to do both with the sounds and the properties and patterns of the musical sounds, as well as our consciousness and our memory and our feeling. So on the one hand, we have developing variation. This is a term that comes from Schoenberg. And then we have something a bit more abstract, perhaps, a bit more phenomenological, which is the sublime. And the sublime is an important aspect of musical form, even though it exists more on the side of our immediate experience or our subjectivity, rather than something that exists in the sounds without any perceiver. So, starting small, we have motives. Motives are little sonic patterns that undergo repetition and variation. They can be rhythmic, they can be melodic, they can even be stylistic or pertaining to the change between parts. You know, A-B form or something like that can be used motively as well. Rhythm is a movement at regular repeated periods. Rhythm is not merely audible, but is also tactile and visible. We feel our heartbeat, and we can watch someone dance. And because of this, rhythm is a synesthetic experience that is rooted in our vital meaning making related to the pulse of the heart, the breath, the movement of our bodies. You know, we also use auditory senses to tell how far away something is, how heavy something is when we think of a thud. All of this is exploitable by the musician. The musician can play on our total sensory motor system in rhythm and motive elements. Now, melody is a continuity of sonic vibrations involving tonal centering and motive repetition. It has a likeness to speech and to the poetic weaving together of images in narrative. Now, melody does this sonically and without the need of any extra musical references or imitations. It is a continuity in time that develops gradually through sonic variation, but this sonic variation is steered, it is made to converge back with itself, and by that I mean it uses repetition. It goes up in a certain scale, it comes back down. It doesn't have to do that exact movement, but it has to retain some structural ordering in order for it to be a melody. Now, feel is something much more embodied and diffuse than melody or rhythm. Melodies and rhythms we can measure, we can calculate, but feel, we can calculate the timbre of an instrument. But why does the saxophone sound sadder, and why does the, for example, piano sound more relaxed or more energetic or what have you, based on the timbral changes? Well, this is something that we feel, right? It is part of the gestural expression of the music, like the tempo and like groove, playing a little bit behind the beat, the feeling that we put into the music by making these very small adjustments. It's everything that the musician does and accomplishes without thinking about it, right? When you swing a golf club, if you think too much about it, you're not going to do it well. It has to be sensory motor know-how. It has to be, you have to feel it in your bones, right? It has to be something you don't think about, that you just do. It's an embodied know-how, which envelops the idea of grace as well as precision. And closely related to this musical form is that of style. This je ne sais quoi, this almost nothing, unnameable quality of expression that is linked to concrete individuality, the uniqueness of the perspectival whole, which is a human being, a human soul, a human life. Now, this is, of course, conditioned by influences and exposure, but it is the unique way, the concrete way, that has come together. For every style, as people who appreciate or perceive or experience this style, there's always a precondition for our appreciation. We need to experience a plurality of this artist's repertoire. We need to get a sense of their style through the multiplicity. It's not a single element. It's not some one thing that they do. And this is not something that is easily imitated, such as in gross cliches and stereotypes of, pop music or something. Artistic style is a loving interpretation of one's influences that shapes and motivates the performance and composition, and is evident, no doubt, it's palpable, but it is also ambiguous, and the inspiration can, of course, sometimes be detected, but it's way more than mere emulation, right? A great composer most emulates their predecessors in the license that they take in inventing a new style of their own. Bit of a paradox, of course. So let's think next of developing variation, the next most complex musical form, perhaps. It is a change of musical content, which at the same time maintains continuity by balancing repetition and variation. The changes that the music undergoes in developing variation are substantive changes. They are not ornament. They are not accidental deformations. They are not random mutations or, sort of reordering of parts. The changes build organically, and the form that they create, this whole, is greater than the sum of the parts, and it is greater because of its gradual enrichment over duration. The composer is able to draw more out of the motive content by building it and putting it alongside other musical motives that are also undergoing variations, but these variations somehow come together and form a unity and something greater than the parts. They reciprocally modify each other and intensify each other because of their ordering in time. And when we put all of the musical forms together and we create beautiful and awe-inspiring music, another form emerges, and this is much more on the side of our inner experience and our participation in the music. That is the sublime. The sublime is the experience of the higher order of magnitude, of this irreducible, more than the sum of the parts quality of musical form. Whenever we experience something that is an order of magnitude, a greater order of magnitude, so melody is a greater order of magnitude than the tones, and a tone is a greater order of magnitude than mere noise. They have properties of organization and in levels of intensity that are greater and irreducible. And when we experience that, there is a profound sentiment that accompanies it. Music, like any spiritual entity, is encountered as a being that exceeds absolute transience. It is a being that endures and that is gradually enriched over duration, that grows in intensity and draws more out of itself than it contains. We experience the power of spirit or of creative imagination and of freedom. We experience spirit as interweaving consciousness in a participatory community, and we are moved by the nobility of this way of creating form, this way of organizing, this way of integrating. And we marvel at the blessedness of what we are capable of, not only in participating in music, but of composing music. Now, there are, on the one hand, ecstatic, sublime feelings in which we flutter on the edge of consciousness, dipping into a trance and almost daydream-like state. And then there is also a tranquil intensity of spiritual presence, bringing one's soul to its depth and the past, and bringing all of who we are and our memories and our aspirations to bear in the act of devotion and to the love which we put into engaging with the music. And this sublime feeling is all the more awe-inspiring and all the more instilling of wonder and greatness and beauty because it's one's own effort and the efforts of our friends and loved ones participating together. There's nothing more inspiring and uplifting than this pleasure and this form that takes hold of our souls when we feel the order of magnitude we are capable of in our participatory action. Now, a qualitative order of magnitude is kind of a paradox because I'm saying an order of magnitude is not a quantity. It's not just a higher quantity. It's a whole new qualitative leap where what we are leaping from can no longer define or determine, or we can no longer reduce the higher order to the lower. It is beyond all measure rather than being a new measure, for instance. You know, our past is irreducible to the present. Our integrative concentration of the past into the present, which is consciousness, enriches our present, and this enriched experience is an order of magnitude irreducible to an immediate sense data. Now, music is an order of magnitude beyond harmony, rhythm, melody, style, developing variation, etc. We can always analyze music. We can always find the pitches, the, length of time, the timbre, and all of this is extremely helpful for musicians. Don't get me wrong, especially as a language for technical problem solving, with things like tuning and modulation and diverse instrumentation in concert. They are helpful for musicians to learn and to orchestrate their performance. It's a rudimentary level of understanding for musical expression. But this information, these concepts, are not capable of bringing out the style and the passion that make great musical performances and make the best compositions. What is so je ne sais quoi and so presque rien, so singularly unique and almost undescribable and fleeting forms. Scalar structures are measurable and memorizable. They have form to them. But the improviser, how do they relate to this scalar form? They, remain within certain scalar structures as they improvise. And this creates a consistent atmosphere and allows them to develop certain feelings. And they will also, of course, switch between different systems, different scalar structures, different modes, keys, and yet they keep the musical movement going continuously. Music is therefore clearly not reducible to scalar structures in at least two senses. First of all, the melody has a particular pattern of tones, and that particular pattern of tones is not contained in the knowledge of the scale. It is something in addition to that scale. It is not reducible to their abstract relation, we could say. And the melody is a movement which is open to novel modulation. And novel modulation means the movement into a different scale, different scalar structure. And we also have other forms like cliché and phrasing. There are so many motive elements that we often tend to think they're infinite. There's an unlimited number of motive elements. But this is not really the case. They are actually, in pop music, in our common music, limited and repeating quite often. The vast mass of music called pop music uses only a few hundred, and that's a generous number, motive elements, and with a minimum of developing variation. Now, orchestration is another way that music has form. We can play a piano piece, and we can set it to orchestra, and we can set it to orchestra in 10 different ways, or to wood ensemble, or to xylophone, or what have you. We can vary aspects of the musical form while keeping other ones the same. So musical form comes in a great variety of ways. All of these forms can play together, and they can play apart, and they can play on one another, and they can integrate, and they can dissipate. But let's think for a minute about these more complex forms like style and sublime. Both of these are rooted in habit, in skill, in character, in moral sentiment, in creative expression, invention, and even philosophical intuition. These virtues are the muses, right? They're what imbue our vital and moral spirit with musical impulses. Is play sublime? What is play? Play, this engagement in action and movement. There's some rules, but the rules are loose, and there's certainly things that don't count as play, and you can become serious and you're no longer playing. There's something lighthearted and jovial about it, joyful. The sublime is more painful, more awe-struck, more serious. There's a really big similarity, though. One knows they are being playful, and that being playful is pleasant. And the consciousness that we are a playful entity, that we are being playful, is enhancing to the joy of play. In addition to what is joyful in the act of playing, there's another joy, which is our awareness that we are engaging playfully and that we are a participating, active, engaged playing entity. We don't have to think about it. It's not a concept. It's not a looking in the mirror. It's not egoistic, but there is a self-knowledge that comes along with the act of play. And as we adapt our playfulness, we become more joyful in the consciousness of being creatively playful, in a playful spirit that connects to moral and even religious sentiments. The musician takes joy in their grace, just as much as they feel pain in the lamentations that they give voice to. The most diverse feelings are integrated in the course of the unfolding of these musical forms, and the weaving of all of it into a whole that is an order of magnitude greater than the parts is the ultimate playful activity and the ultimate joyful integration. Developing variation, too, opens this sort of new formal development, which is irreducible to song structure and to scalar structure and things like that. It is not a combination of techniques running in conjunction, but calls us to engage playfully in a new way, to be inventive of a new form of integration and unity. Now, of course, musicians invent songs and melodies by putting together, arranging, and varying motive elements. No musician has ever made up every single part of a song. There's never been a song that has been played every single pattern novelly, that has never repeated anything that the musician has heard before. There have been mighty efforts in recent years coming from very different traditions with totally different intentions, even within the same traditions, to vary music in its degree of novelty that escapes from the way that music has sounded before, to escape the past, to completely make novel sounds and novel patterns and novel forms, or to reject musical forms of tradition. The emotional and harmonic tendencies of European music were deeply sedimented. There were certain ways that things would be made happy, things would be made sad. There was the sonata forms and all of these musical forms that were highly sedimented, and we could even say regulated. At the end of the 19th century, breaking these well-established functional rules became an all-out arms race, practically, to most efficiently subdue the emergence of tonality and musical forms, historical musical forms. The visions fugitives of Prokofiev hang on by a thread on the edge of the abyss of atonal chaos. And this atonal chaos singes and vaporizes the melodic continuity, but there's an ebb and flow moving to and from them. We dip in and out of order, and the repetition builds and transforms and enriches the musical experience beyond the parts, beyond the limitations of musical forms from tradition as well. Things like the crescendo, the break, all of the moments that have the particular feeling because of the context and the duration in which they arise. All of this world of the afterwards, right? This having context because of the past, inheriting a background from which the spectacle emerges into view, and opening a horizon unique to its temporal moment. This is the ultimate aspect of musical form. The temporal, the developmental, the change, the transformational, the paradigm shifting, the nascent change of direction. The musical form is deeply rooted in this sense of having a past, having a context of meaning, having a future, having a possibility of changing our orientation and our view on things. When we engage in higher musical forms, these higher order forms, developing variation, sublime, in even complex melody, and even in higher musical forms like sonata or fugue or anything, what we have is as much a new objective structure as a new internal devotion, a new vocation, a new way of looking at things, a new horizon, and a new depth to be plumbed. They call for a new way of engaging with composition, And especially in things like developing variation, there's no established rules that can be followed. One must be led by play, by passion, by wit, and imagination. One must draw on their influences and reinterpret them and step out into the void, into something new. The inner life and the mood which they make possible are going to come about through developing variation within our consciousness, within this possibility of drawing more out of the music than it contains. A new adaptation of the human being, of the brain, a new psychical makeup, a new way of integrating our past and our life. Musical form is fluid with the forms of consciousness, embodiment, our brain, our being in the world, our being in community. The modulation and the transformation of musical forms, our developing variation, proves that musical forms will come about which we do not yet know, which we cannot yet anticipate, and which will be truly sublime.